British colonial empire. The empire on which the sun never sets. Although the British, who can be called the elder brother of overseas colonialism, started their first exploitation activities after Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands, it went down in history as the empire with the largest colonial lands. So how did the British turn from an island state to an empire with endless lands on which the sun never sets? Let's examine this together. Until the 15th century, Europe had followed a largely introverted policy and was often preoccupied with the devastating wars between France and the British. However, after the 15th century, it had to open up to the outside world to increase its population and gain new economic gains. The invention and widespread use of printing press, gunpowder, and the compass in this period led European states, especially Spain and Portugal, to the open seas. Ceuta made history as the first place to be colonized in 1415, while European sailors left their first overseas footprints in Ceuta in North Africa. Over time, the new lands discovered by these Portuguese and Spaniards through colonialism and the cheap labor they obtained began to whet the appetite of the British. Thereupon, from the end of the 15th century, the British sailed to the seas and started overseas colonial activities. The first overseas voyage began in 1496 when King Henry VII commissioned a sailor named Giovanni Sabato to find a route from the North Atlantic to Asia. Reaching the coast of Newfoundland, which is on the borders of today's Canada, in 1497 with a ship of 5 pieces, Sabato didn't attempt to establish any colony there. Sabato, who stayed here for a year, turned to exploration again the next year, but he was never heard from again. After this incident, the British, who didn't engage in any overseas activities for a long time, returned to the seas with the accession of Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth, who wanted to take her share in the colonial world, sent the sailor Martin Frobisher on an expedition to the West Lands beyond the Atlantic Ocean in 1576. After a one-year voyage, Martin landed on the island of Baffin in Northeast America in 1577 and seized it in the name of Queen Elizabeth. However, due to the cold climate of the region and the fact that almost half of the island was covered with ice, he left here in a short time. After continuing to wander around the region, Frobisher, who reached Greenland, seized it in the name of the Queen, but had to leave the region in a short time for the same reasons. In 1580, the first colonization movements in North America were initiated, this time under the leadership of an English sailor named Walter Raleigh. After a difficult journey, Walter, who set foot in the lands of today's North Carolina, founded the first British colony, which he named Virginia in honor of Queen Elizabeth I. However, this colony had a very short lifespan. The colony, which had supply problems due to the long distance from the English mainland and the naval wars with the Spanish, was completely evacuated in the middle of 1590. Thus, the first colonial adventure of the British failed. While the British continued their colonization activities on the American front, on the other hand, they continued their search for colonies in Asia. There was one place in particular that whetted the appetite of the English, as well as the Portuguese and the Dutch: India. This large Central Asian region was adorning the colonial dreams of all European states, both with its wealth and because it was the starting point of the spice trade. In 16,000, a few merchants, supported by Queen Elizabeth, set off with a letter written by the Queen's hand, and set off for the Mughal Empire, which dominated most of India. The merchants persuaded the third Mughal Emperor Akbar Shah and started the activities of the British East India Company on 31st December 16,000. The company created a trade bridge between India and England thanks to the concessions it obtained from both the Queen and the Mughal Empire. The company, which subsequently expanded its dominance to the East Indies, the Malay Peninsula, established its first permanent trade center on the island of Java in 1602. When Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, although England was not a significant colonial territory, she left a good colonial plan for her successor, James I. James I, who ascended the British throne in 1603 and immediately ended the naval wars with the Spaniards. He then accelerated his colonial activities in North America. The first permanent English colony in the Americas was established in 1607 at Jamestown, in what is now Virginia. Although the population of Jamestown, which was established with 300 people taken by ships from London, increased to 14,000 in a short time, it fell to 12,000 after 1 year due to the Indian raids and disease. The second settlement founded by the English in 1609 was Henrico, a little north of Jamestown. Although Guiana colony, which was established in the South America in the same year, went down in history as the first colonial land of the English in South America, they lost these lands to the Dutch in a short time. From this date on, the British, who focused on colonization activities in North America, expanded their colonial lands until 1750 and became significant landowners. While these were happening in America, the British, who had good relations with the Mughal Empire in India, established trade centers in Bengal and Bihar after India. According to the British, the only nation that could pose a danger to them in the Indian geography was the Dutch, who came before them and knew well how the trade was going in the region. Dutch traders were selling the region's products at better prices than British traders, and British traders were unable to break the Dutch hegemony in the Indian Ocean. However, this would soon change. In 1651, the British published a bill under the name of the Act of Navigation, and according to this law, other state companies were prohibited from trading in the British colonies. This arrangement was seen by the Dutch as a deliberate blow to shipping. Thus, while entering the period of naval wars to be experienced between the two states, both sides couldn't achieve success in the three naval wars between 1652 and 1672. In this period, when the two colonial states were fighting each other, a new rival joined the power struggle in India. This rival was France, under the name of the French East India Company. The French company became the new rival of the British by building a factory in Surat in 1668 and Calcutta in 1690. However, thanks to the strong relations with the Mughal Empire over the years, the Mughal ruler of that time, Alamgir Shah, gave the British East India Company the right to use the lands of several villages in Calcutta and Madrasa. Thus, the British acquired the first colonial territories in India, even within the borders of the Mughal Empire. After the death of Mughal ruler Alamgir Shah in 1707, while there was a vacuum of authority in the Indian lands, the governors began to act independently against the central government. During this internal turmoil, the officers of the British East India Company formed their military unit, consisting of Indian soldiers, which they trained in need of protection. This military force, which was initially established for defensive purposes, would lead to the seizure of Indian lands by the British in the following years. This brought the French against the British, who were trying to establish a strong Indian company in the region. However, the rivalry between France and England was not limited to Indian geography. As a matter of fact, the colonies of both states in North America were a matter of a debate in terms of borders. Even though England was transferring people to its colonies in North America due to its increasing population on the mainland, after a while it started to be insufficient in the colonies it had. For this reason, it started to expand its territory towards the inner parts of the North America, causing the French and British armies to come face to face. In 1755, the British army under General Boscawen destroyed a French battalion in the Ohio Valley. This event led to the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, which started between France and England and was later joined by Prussia, Austria, and Russia. While Austria took Russia and Sweden to its side and formed an alliance against Prussia, England allied with Prussia against France. The British first gained the upper hand in the North America by taking Ohio in 1757, Quebec in 1759, and Montreal in 1760 from the French. Then, in 1763, the British invaded French-controlled Bengal, completely ending French rule in India. With the Treaty of Paris signed between England and France on February 10, 1763, the French left all of their colonies in North America and India to England. Thus, the British doubled their colonial lands in America. However, when the British tried to cover the economic damage they suffered during the 7 Years' War with the additional taxes they brought to their colonies in North America, the British colonies in the Americas united and rebelled, causing the War of Independence. While an American Congress was held in 1774, including George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, the colonies decided that taxes could only be possible with the laws prepared by them. The American War of Independence, which started in 1775, ended with the defeat of British in 1783. While the independence of the United States of America was officially accepted with the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783, the British lost all their colonies except Canada as a result of this agreement. Fortunately, the British, who made a breakthrough in colonialism, quickly found new ones to replace the lands they lost. The British, who set foot in Africa in 1784, established their first colony on this continent in the Gambia. In addition, the east coast of Australia, which was covered by the British navigator James Cook in 1790, was quickly colonized by the British. Thus, England became a giant empire that ruled over 5 continents. During the Coalition Wars, the British continued their expansion by annexing French-controlled Trinidad and Tobago, Dutch-controlled Guyana, and Sri Lanka in 1793. In addition, the British, who took the opportunity of the Mughal Empire, which was experiencing internal turmoil, to ask for help from them, continued its expansion in these lands by taking control of half of India, thanks to the army established by the East India Company. The British East India Company, which started commercial activities in China after India, has been doing opium trade with China since the 1730s. However, when China banned the opium trade in 1839, the First Opium War broke out between the Europeans and China. The East India Company, which profited from this war, occupied the Hong Kong region, which was the rich commercial center of China. Although the East India Company was responsible for the Asian activities of England, some arrangements were made for the company from the end of the 18th century. In particular, some laws were enacted, such as the Charter Act of 1813, which established the dominance of the British royal administration in the lands under the control of the company. In 1857, while the revolt of Indian soldiers who were dependent on the British spread to all of India, the existence of the company was terminated by England, and all of India, Burma, and Malaysia came under the rule of England. As soon as the British government took control of India, a government-appointed Governor-General began to rule India, and Queen Victoria was crowned Empress of India. While these were happening in Asia, the British annexed the entire island of Australia until 1850. It also made another landing on the African island and colonized South Africa, Sierra Leone, and Ghana. As for the Americas, it expanded its territory in North America and dominated all lands east of Alaska and north of the United States. It also colonized Jamaica and Belize and didn't neglect to plant the British flag in Central America. In 1869, the opening of the Suez Canal, which was very important in terms of maritime transportation in Egypt, caused the British to accelerate its African activities. Although the British initially opposed the construction of the Suez Canal, they realized the strategic value of the region when they saw the profit from the canal. In 1875, the British government bought the 44% share of the Egyptian governor, Ismail Pasha, in the Suez Canal for £4 million. This situation suddenly made the British influence in the region. While these were happening in Africa, the start of the 1877-1878 Ottoman-Russian War in Europe was a development that closely concerned England. After the Ottoman Empire lost this war, which was called the 93rd War, Sultan Abdulhamid left the island of Cyprus under the auspices of England on the condition that the Ottomans be supported against the Russians. This situation was planned by the British. The British, who made Cyprus a base, landed troops in North Africa in 1882 and completely occupied Egypt. In this way, the British would not only be able to advance into the interior of Africa, but also easily reach the lands of the Middle East that they have coveted. Although the Suez Canal was the reason why the British gave so much importance to Africa at first, economic reasons were also involved due to the cheap labor, gold, and precious stone that the French obtained from Africa. Continuing their expansion in Africa until World War I, the British acquired many new colonies from Sudan to East Africa, from Somalia to Rhodesia, and from Nigeria to Togo. It also set foot on the Arabian Peninsula and added the so-called Armistice states to its colonial territory. When World War I broke out, the majority of the soldiers that made up the British army were indigenous people in the British colonies. This meant a land force of about 3 million people. During the days when the war was in full swing, the British and the French made a secret agreement and divided the Middle Eastern lands to be won from the Ottoman state. While this agreement entered into force after the victory of the war in 1918, Britain added countries with significant oil reserves such as Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq to the islands of colonial kingdom. Thus, the British Empire reached the largest territory in its history in 1918. In the period after the First World War, England, which started a new structure in Canada, which is its colony on the American continent, first divided the country into an administration consisting of 4 federations. Then, in 1926, it unified these 4 federations and declared that it officially recognized the independence of Canada. Thus, the British left the colonial lands in the North American continent after about 4 centuries. By 1939, the Second World War, which started with the new German attack on Poland, continued with France and England declaring war against Germany. After Germany invaded France in 1940, until the Soviet Union declared war on Germany, Britain fought alone against Nazi Germany. Although the British were on the winning side as a result of the Second World War, which lasted for about 6 years, the superpower appellate of the empire, on which the sun never sets, was removed. The fact that it was defeated in some naval battles with Japan during the Second World War and lost Singapore as a result of the war was an indication that Britain was no longer as strong as it used to be. The independence uprisings that took place in the colonies after the war were about to cause disaster for England, which was already coming out of the war with a great economic ruin. That's why British leader Churchill declared that he could agree to a peaceful separation from his colonies as long as strong governments were established. The first country to gain independence in this policy was India, which it had seen as the apple of its eye for centuries. India and Pakistan declared their independence from Britain in 1947 and became two separate states. A year later, in 1948, the British announced their withdrawal from Jordan and Palestine. In the same year, Sri Lanka became another country that gained its independence. After this date, like dominoes, Burma in 1949, Sudan in 1956, Ghana in 1957, Cyprus and Nigeria in 1960, Jamaica, Uganda, and Trinidad and Tobago in 1962, Malaysia, Tanzania, and Kenya in 1963, Zambia in 1964, Guyana, Barbados, and Rhodesia in 1966, Yemen in 1967, Lesotho and Swaziland in 1968, Bahrain and Qatar in 1971, Bahamas and Belize in 1973, and Brunei in 1984 gained their independence from Britain. The last colony to leave the imperial territory was Hong Kong. Hong Kong, a rich commercial city with a population of 3 million, left the UK in 1997 and joined the People's Republic of China, and the British colonial empire became history. Well, let's get to the main question. Do you think these countries that gained their independence formed a stable government? Or are these countries that declared independence really independent today? I leave the answers to these questions to you. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video. French colonial empire. The empire that could not fit on its mainland in Europe and colonized these regions by dominating overseas lands, especially Africa. How did the French, who never left a foothold from Asia to Middle East, from Africa to North America, manage to establish such a great empire? Another question is, did France, which gave independence to most of its colonies in 1960, severed its ties with these countries today? For the answers to these questions, don't forget to watch the video until the end, comment for support, and press the like button. After the emergence of the European consciousness that started with the Renaissance, geographical discoveries and colonized activities began. In this period, the use of printing press, gunpowder, and compass provided a significant advantage in favor of the Europeans, while at the same time it caused an increase in reconnaissance and combat power. This superiority they achieved provided a great opportunity for Spain, England, and France to establish colonies outside the mainland. In the history of world colonialism, France and England were in constant competition and struggled throughout history. They continued their war situation in Europe, in the lands they want to establish colonies. Sometimes England and sometimes France emerged victories from these conflicts and wars, while they consolidated their imperial identities. One of the most important reasons why France became an imperial power was, of course, the establishment of colonies in Africa and overseas, along with the Industrial Revolution. In fact, during this period, France didn't have the ability to prepare a project to expand its borders and increase its power, because more than half of its budget was only going to debts, and it was experiencing the disadvantages of having a stagnant population structure. In order to get rid of this financial bottleneck, it had to develop its industry with cheap labor as soon as possible. Of course, while doing this, raw material resources and a wide market was needed. France would find these deficiencies in colonialism by adapting to the New World Order. So where should France start? From the newly discovered America? From the spice paradise of India? From Asia? Or from the future slave paradise of Africa? Moving towards the end of the 17th century, the French decided to make expeditions to both America and India. Having both a small land in Pondicherry, India, the French succeeded in becoming the third European state to colonize India after the Portuguese and British, continuing their efforts to gain more territory. The French captured Chandernagor in Bengal in 1730. However, the French army, who could not fight the British presence in India, lost the lands they had captured to the British and had to withdraw from India. As for the expedition to America, the French became the third European country to colonize the America after the Spanish and the British. Quickly advancing inland, explorers soon managed to colonize a large area from Mississippi to Chicago, from Ontario to Montreal and Quebec, while occupied Guyana and Saint-Domingue in the South American continent. However, in 1756, things started to turn bad for the French. In the 7 Years' War that started on this date, France, who could not gain superiority against the British, despite taking Austria, Russia, and Spain, became the losing side at the end of the war. As a result of the Treaty of Paris signed, France left all of its lands in the North American continent to the British, while England provided its superiority in the seas and colonialism. Of course, in return, France lost a lot of power both economically and politically. In this situation paved the way for the French Revolution. When the French Revolution broke out in 1789, the Holy Roman Empire, England, the Russian Empire, Spain, and Portugal, which did not accept the Republican government declared in France, declared war on France. In the War of the First Coalition, which started with the proclamation of the First French Republic in 1792, France became the victorious party. Subsequently, when War of the Second Coalition broke out in 1798, the Spanish Empire sided with France in this war. While the Franco-Spanish partnership prevailed in the War of the Second Coalition, which ended in 1802, the cooperation between the two states gradually increased. In fact, with the Treaty of the Amiens signed between the two states in 1802, Spain gifted the Louisiana lands in North America to France. The Americans, who had recently revolted against the British colony, established a state called the United States of America as a result of the War of Independence in 1783. America, which has an extremely innovative, powerful army, was constantly trying to expand its territory. Here, the new lands of the French, which Spain gave as a gift, bordered this powerful state. During this period, the French, under the leadership of Napoleon, were making important wars against England, Russia, and the Holy Roman Empire. Therefore, the colonial territories in America were a burden on the shoulders of France. Wishing to turn it into money, Napoleon asked the then American President Jefferson if he wanted to buy the Louisiana land. Although Jefferson was quite surprised by this offer, he immediately accepted Napoleon's offer. With the agreement made in Paris on April 30, 1803, 2,100,000 square kilometers of land was sold to America for $15 million. The French, whose adventure in America did not have a happy ending, this time set their sights on the vast African lands. Although the French presence in Africa dates back to the 17th century, the main period of colonial expansion began with the occupation of Algeria in the 19th century. The argument that broke out between Hussein Pasha, the Ottoman governor in Algeria, and the French consul suddenly turned into a naval blockade. As a result of this blockade, which lasted for about 3 years, the French army succeeded in occupying the center of Algeria in 1830. However, Algerians chose to resist this occupation and started a revolt against the French under the leadership of Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. During this period, the French were able to hold only a few port cities due to the lack of adequate support due to the internal turmoil in France. When the dates show 1840, the French, who set foot in Senegal and Equatorial Guinea, colonized this region, and when the support force reached Algeria from the other arm, they started to attack towards the inner parts of Algeria. After the fierce conflicts, all Algerian lands were captured by the French until the end of 1847. As a result of the French attacks to impose their hegemony on Algerians, between 500,000 and 1 million Algerians lost their lives due to the conflict, famine, and disease. With the colonization of Algeria, the French colonial period, which would last more than a century, began in North Africa. On the date show of the year 1848, the monarchy was destroyed once again as a result of the revolution in France, and the Second French Republic was established in 1852 under the leadership of Third Napoleon. During the Third Napoleonic period, while the French colonial lands were doubled, the territories in Algeria and Senegal were expanded. New Caledonia was colonized in 1853, and Cambodia was invaded in 1863, creating a colonial region called French Indochina. Although slavery was abolished in France with the 1848 revolution, the French continued to treat the natives as slaves in all the regions they captured. Even tried to spread Christianity by imposing on the regions they colonized. In addition, France banned the Muslim pilgrim candidates from Algeria and Senegal from going to Mecca and demanded that the same ban be applied to the other states with Muslim citizens. When the dates showed 1870, the Third French Republic was established in France. Under the new management, the French turned their attention back to North Africa, with Tunisia as their first target. The Ottoman Empire was defeated in the War of 93 in 1878, and the collapse process accelerated. In the Berlin Agreement signed after the War of 93, when everyone had a share from the Ottomans, the French also took action to seize Tunisia. Although the French government made many improvements in various fields, from transportation to industry, from financial system to public health, after occupying Algeria and Tunisia, it could not get the sympathy of the citizens of the country in any way. By 1890, while the French began to expand the lands they controlled in West Africa, the explorer Colonel Parfait-Louis Monte had a big share in this. Colonel Monte set out from West Africa between 1890 and 1892 and brought the region as far as Niger and Lake Chad to the French colonial empire. Another French force which set out from Ecuadorian Guinea moved east and captured the region up to Central Africa, while a small unit that set foot in East Africa succeeded in occupying Djibouti, also sending additional troops to the Indochina. The French expanded their colonial territory in Asia by capturing all of Vietnam and Eastern Siam in 1894. The insatiable French set their sights on the Spanish-controlled Morocco in 1912. Although Morocco had been under the Spanish protectorate since 1884, the country was still reigning. With the French army entering the Moroccan territory, Sultan Abdulhamid had to sign an agreement with the French, while the country became a French colony since 1912. Although the Moroccans, who did not want to live under the French yoke, attacked the French garrison in Fez on April 7, 1912, the events were calmed down by the arrival of the French reinforcements, and a large part of Morocco was taken under control by the French. After this date, France, which continued to expand its colonized lands in Africa until 1914, the date of the start of the First World War, came to control 1/3 of the African continent. After the end of the First World War, the French, who made an agreement with the British, added the Syrian lands lost by the Ottoman state at the end of the war to the colonial empire. Thus, the French colonial empire also took over the Middle East after South America, Africa, and Asia. Another feature of the French colonial project at the beginning of the 20th century was the mission of the Christianization, under the name of civilization. It was the duty of European white men to bring civilization to uncivilized black people, according to the church. For this purpose, the French tried to franchise the people under their colonies by adopting the French language and culture. Although Africans who adapted French culture and traditions were promised equal rights with French citizens, this never materialized. It was obvious that such ostensible policies, which were put into effect due to the persecution of the people in the occupied lands, were made to keep the colonial lands. while this assimilation policy of the French continued until 1939, when the Second World War started. The occupation of the France by the Germans in 1940 caused dark clouds to circulate over Africa. Even though the African natives welcomed the occupation of the French mainland, they didn't know that the end of this would touch them. The French, who promised independence to the African natives, who fought alongside France during World War II, recruited a considerable number of African soldiers into the army. However, French Indochina, which couldn't achieve this in the colonial territories in Asia, was occupied by the Japanese in 1941. By 1943, around 3,000 African and Arab origin soldiers in the French army were helping the liberation of the France. The Africans, who were struggling with their heart, did not realize that they were deceived once again. Charles de Gaulle, the temporary president of France, didn't have the idea of liberating the colonies in mind. The manifesto proclaimed at the Conference of the Colonial Governors in January 1944 read, "The goals of the civilization work undertaken by France in the colonies exclude any idea of the autonomy. However, the idea of possible independence in the colonies will be totally rejected." When the dates show the year 1945, the Second World War was over, and the French mainland was freed from occupation. Now it was time to keep the promise of independence made by the French. With a statement made by the French government, it was announced that the colonial order in Africa would continue, but Africans who met the conditions would be granted French citizenship. This disappointing statement sparked revolt in all the French colonies. The French government, which wanted to suppress the revolt, made a constitutional amendment at the end of 1946 and decided to elect representatives from the local people to the colonial administration in Africa. However, it had no effect on the revolts, and on the contrary led to its aggravation in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, which are called the Maghreb region. In 1953, when the French exiled the Moroccan king, Sultan Mohammed V, to Madagascar, on the grounds that he supported the rebellion, this event further fueled the Moroccan struggle against French and Spanish patronage, especially the Oujda incident, in which the Moroccans attacked the French in the middle of the street, was the peak of the rebellion. After this event, France allowed King Mohammed V to return to Morocco in 1955, while negotiations on independence began the following year. On March 2nd, the French army withdrew from Morocco, and on April 7th, 1956, the Kingdom of Morocco officially gained its independence. French troops withdrew from Tunisia on March 20th, 1956. 18 days after the withdrawal from Festan, Tunisia declared its independence on July 25th, 1957. After the liberation of Morocco and Tunisia, other hopeful African nations increased their revolts against the French. Returning to Asia, a fierce struggle for independence began in French Indochina in 1946. After the end of the Second World War, the French army could not achieve enough success due to its distance from the mainland of France. It could only last until 1954. As a result of the Geneva Conference held in 1954, while France withdrew from Indochina, new states named Northern Vietnam, Southern Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were established in these lands. When the dates showed 1958, Charles de Gaulle, who was the president of the Fifth French Republic, observed that the French economy had weakened due to the riots. He realized that there was no point in resisting anymore, and in January 1959, he decided to grant the independence to Senegal. This sudden event created a shock effect in French West Africa, while at the same time, it brought about the independence of all French colonies. In 1960, the French government accepted the independence of Benin, Burkina Faso, Chad, Congo, Ivory Coast, and Mali one by one. Now, only Algeria and Djibouti remained as the French colonies on the African continent. Especially the Algerians' War of Independence is an epic story that can be told in a single video. The struggle leaders gathered in Tangier in 1958 while establishing the provisional government of the Republic of Algeria. The struggle for independence would now be carried out through this government. Charles de Gaulle
stated that he would bring a political solution to this issue at a time when the environment of revolt and conflict in Algeria reached its peak. In May 1961, a delegation sent by de Gaulle began official talks with the Algerian provisional government. After 6 months of negotiations, a referendum decision was taken on March 18, 1962 in the country. In the referendum held on July 1, 1962, 6 million people voted in favor of independence and 16,000 voted against it. After the referendum was positive, Algeria finally became an independent country on July 5, 1962. During the 8-year War of Independence, while 2 million peasants were forced to leave their land, more than 250,000 Algerians lost their lives. By 1977, while Djibouti, the last French colony in Africa, gained independence, the French persecution that started in 1830 ended. Do you think political independence granted meant the end of the French rule in Africa? I think I would have answered this question adequately if I said that 19 of these 27 African countries that gained independence from France in the last 20 years had a military code. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.
All Russian occupations in 12,000 years from past to present. The first Slavic tribes known in recorded history began to live in the west of today's Russia from the 8th century. Rurik, who became the head of the tribe in the 9th century, founded the Novgorod Principality in Novgorod, which is considered the first Russian state. After Rurik's death in 1879, he was succeeded by Oleg, Rurik's close relative. A successful commander, Oleg not only ruled around Novgorod, but also expanded his territory by subordinating the Slavs along the Dnieper River. Oleg, who started to descend to the south with the aim of capturing the great trade route, reached the gates of Kiev after capturing the cities of Smolensk and Lyubik. Since Kiev was in a very important geographical and strategical position, he killed a Varangian named Askold and Dir and captured Kiev. Kiev was very important economically on the Scandinavian Byzantine trade route. That's why Oleg, while declaring Kiev the new capital of the country, has changed the name of the principality to the Principality of Kiev. After Oleg's death, the Kiev Principality, which continued to expand during the reign of Igor I and later Sviatoslav, began to organize expeditions against the Khazar Khaganate. As a result of these expeditions, especially during the Sviatoslav period, the Khazar Khaganate was weakened and completely disintegrated in 1048. Towards the end of the 11th century, the Kipchaks, who came from the Central and Eastern Asia and settled down in the southern steppe regions of Russia, established a nomadic state here. The raids organized by the state began to threaten the Kievan Principality and the West Slavic people. Fearing the attacks of the Kipchaks, the country, which experienced internal turmoil, was divided into many small pieces within itself, with the migration of the Western Slavic people to the Kievan Principality. One of these small Russian states was the Principality of Novgorod. Sviatoslav Olgovich, the leader of Novgorod, established the Republic of Novgorod, the first republic in Russian history, in 1135 after conquering eastern Scandinavia. Despite the Mongol invasion of many Russian principalities, at the beginning of the 13th century, Novgorod was one of the few Russian states to survive this invasion. The developed urban culture was almost completely destroyed by the impact of the brutal Mongol invasion on Russian lands. Old centers such as Kiev and Vladimir, which could not escape the destruction caused by these attacks. During this period, the city of Moscow, which was subject to the Golden Horde state,
developed rapidly during the reigns of Third Yuri, Ivan I and Semyon, and in 1340 turned into a Moscow principality. In 1462, Ivan III, one of the greatest leaders in Russian history, became the head of the Moscow principality. Ivan III abolished the Republic of Novgorod in 1478, which he saw as a rival and was in constant conflict, and seized its lands. Then, in 1497, he raided eastern Lithuania and took back the old Russian lands after 200 years. Thus, while the Russian lands stretched to the Ottoman border, Russian-Ottoman relations started for the first time in this period. Heading east in 1502, Ivan III won the war on the Don coast and wiped out the Golden Horde from the stage of the history. When Ivan III ascended the throne, he had left a strong and great state behind, and when he died in 1505, after ruling Moscow, which was a city-state for exactly 43 years. While this development of Moscow continued during the reign of Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, the country became a Tsar in 1547. Until 1584, when Ivan IV died, he captured the Kazan Khanate, the Astrakhan Khanate, and the Sibir Khanate, and succeeded in making the Russian Tsardom the largest state in terms of area. When Ivan died of a stroke during a chess game in 1584, his son Fyodor Ivanovich took the throne. During the reign of Fyodor, who was on the throne for 14 years, the Russian Tsardom experienced a quiet period. Since the last leader of the Rurik dynasty, Fyodor, died in 1598 without leaving any heirs, the period of interregnum began in the Russian Tsardom. Over the next 3 years, the extreme cold, which killed almost a third of the population, destroyed the crops, which led to the Russian famine of 1601-1603. During the next 15 years, it was one of the most turbulent and violent periods in Russian history, while there were 6 crown changes in just 15 years. This interregnum ended in 1613, when Mikhail Romanov came to the throne as Tsar. Romanov's first act, as soon as he came to the throne, was to enter the Polish-Lithuanian Union and the war with Sweden. However, fighting on 2 fronts was a most wrong decision for a state that had just come out of the interregnum. Fortunately, realizing this early, Romanov signed peace with 2 countries in 1617. These agreements caused the Russian Tsar to lose Kiev and Smolensk. After this date, while the Romanov direction was turning east, the Nogai Horde, a Turkish state, was occupied by the Russian Tsardom. Then until 1645, when the Romanov died, almost all of the Siberia was occupied. During the reign of Alexei I, who came to the throne after Romanov, the Russians turned their direction to the west again. In the Russo-Polish War that started in 1654, although the Russian army captured a considerable amount of land at first, it lost Smolensk and Kiev again until the war ended in 1667. As for the east, the conquest of Siberia was completed during the period, while the foundations of the first Russian settlements on the Pacific coast were laid. By 1682, one of the most successful leaders in Russian history, Peter I, took the throne. Peter understood the way to make Russia a world country was through maritime trade, but the icy seas to the north weren't working for him. Therefore, it was necessary to have land on the Black Sea coast in warm seas. Taking action for this purpose, Peter organized his first military expedition against the Ottomans after a long siege that started in 1695. He succeeded in taking the Azak Castle on the Black Sea coast from the Ottomans in 1696. Later turning north, Peter formed a secret alliance with Poland-Lithuania in 17,000. Starting the Great Northern War against Sweden. After 21 years of war, Sweden had to ask for peace. As a result of the agreement, the Baltic region and the region to the east of the Gulf of Finland were left to the Russians. At the end of all these achievements, Peter I received the title of Emperor, while the Russian Tsardom officially became the Russian Empire in 1721. After the deaths of Peter the Great in 1725, power changed hands in coups for 15 years. Finally, in 1740, as the fight for the throne came to an end, Yelizaveta came to power. The Russian Empire, which gave priority to the Turkestan region during the Yelizaveta period, captured the west of the Kazakh Khanate in this period. Again in this period, the Russians, who set foot in the Alaska region of the American continent for the purpose of fur trade, began to settle in these regions over time. Thanks to the fur trade from America to Russia in the following years, all Alaskan lands were colonized by the Russians. During the reign of Catherine the Great, who ascended the throne after Yelizaveta, importance was given to science and education in the country, while important land gains were achieved at the same time. The Russians, who were victorious in the Ottoman-Russian War between 1768 and 1774, signed the Küçük-Kaynarca Treaty with the Ottomans. As a result of the treaty, while the autonomous status was given to Crimea, in 1783 the Crimea completely passed into the hands of Russians. In 1796, the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Union was occupied, and the existence of the state was ended. Catherine the Great, who managed to rule the Russian throne with an iron fist for 32 years, left behind a strong European state when she died in 1796. When Alexander I, a descendant of Catherine, ascended to the throne in 1801, he continued expansionist policy like Catherine. After occupying most of the Kazakh lands in 1801, he turned to the Caucasus and expanded the Russian lands to the borders of Qajar dynasty. Then 1809, he started the Northern War against the Swedish kingdom, taking Finland from the Swedish kingdom that same year. In 1812, he took the Bessarabia region from the Ottomans and added a new one to his lands. Napoleon, who achieved great success in Europe during this period, when the Russian gains land, one after the other, decided to march on Russia. The French army, which set out in June 1812, reached the gates of Moscow on September 7. As a result of the battle in the town of Borodino, the Russian army retreated with heavy losses, and Napoleon occupied Moscow the next day. However, there was no one left to take over the city of Moscow, and the soldiers, bureaucrats, and the people had completely evacuated the city. Napoleon had to withdraw from Russia on 14th December because the Russian Tsar didn't agree to the peace treaty, and the army could not be supplied in the winter conditions. In pursuit of the utterly weakened French soldiers, Alexander I invaded the east coast of the German city-states under the auspices of Napoleon. Marching to the Caucasus from another branch, the Russians marched on the Qajar dynasty. While the war in Azerbaijani lands resulted in Russian victory, the Qajars had to leave most of their lands in Caucasus to the Russians. Alexander I, who died of typhus during a trip to southern Russia in December 1825, was succeeded by his young brother Nicholas I. Nicholas I chose to give more importance to Turkestan and the Balkans region and occupied all of the Kazakhstan until 1830. In addition, he won the Ottoman-Russian War of 1828-1829, and as a result of the Treaty of Adrianople, which was made, he ensured the independence of Greece. In 1848, at a time when the revolutions ravaged Europe, Russia preferred to remain silent, while the Western states, which were disturbed by the situation, began to isolate Russia. Then, with the outbreak of the Ottoman-Russian War in 1853, England and France joined the war on the side of Ottomans. After a tough war in Crimea, Russia suffered a heavy defeat. The Treaty of Paris signed after this defeat, the Black Sea was demilitarized, and all of the shipyards on the Black Sea coast had to be demolished. After the deaths of Nicholas I during the Crimean War in 1855, Alexander II ascended the throne. During his reign, Alexander II did best to revive industry and make peasants landowners. Although he was successful in domestic politics, Alexander II, who could not show the same success in foreign policy, sold Alaska to the United States in 1867. The reason was that he was afraid that this colony, which was difficult to supply and in case of war, would fall into the hands of the British. In 1877, the Ottoman-Russian War, also known as the War of 93, began. Although the Russians captured Ottoman lands, they had to retreat it with the intervention of the Western states. With the Berlin Treaty, Kars, Ardahan, Artvin, and Batumi were left to Russia. After the death of Alexander II in 1881, his son Tsar Alexander III succeeded him. While the occupation of the Central Asia by Russia was completed during the reign of his empire, he received important territorial and commercial concessions from China. While Russia didn't enter into any major wars during his reign, Alexander III, who was called peaceful for this reason, died of kidney disease in 1894. When his son Nicholas II succeeded him, the Industrial Revolution, which began to have a significant impact in Russia, began to create forces that would overthrow the Tsardom. By 1903, while many communist parties were formed, strong opposition leaders such as Vladimir Lenin, Lev Trotsky, and Yuli Martov emerged. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia occupied Manchuria, taking its place among the states that intervened in China to suppress Boxer rebellion. However, when this occupation conflicted with the interests of Japan, war broke out between the parties in 1904. When the war ended with Russia's defeat a year later, this failure increased in internal unrest. As a result of the events that followed, the transition to a constitutional monarchy was made, and the first constitution of Russia was drawn up in 1906. Despite these developments, the internal turmoil in the imperial lands did not come to an end. The year 1914. After the Bosnian Serb nationalist Gavrilo Princip killed the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary gave an ultimatum to the Russian Protectorate of Serbia. Since Russia had no obligations to Serbia, the Duma Assembly wanted to avoid war. However, despite this opinion of the Assembly, Nicholas II mobilized all forces and brought the Russian Empire into the First World War. Although the Russian army was quite large, it was rather weak in terms of equipment, logistics, and organization. Accordingly, heavy losses against the Germans and repeated defeats forced the Russian army to retreat. On top of this, with the February Revolution in the country, Nicholas II was dethroned and a temporary government was established instead. However, the interim government could not remedy the internal turmoil. With the October Revolution that followed, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, overthrew the provisional government and seized power. Subsequently, Russia withdrew unconditionally from World War I. However, this time the Russian Civil War broke out between the opponents of the Bolsheviks and the new regime. After the Russian Civil War, which lasted for 5 years, the Bolsheviks won, and in 1922, the Soviet Union was declared under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. After this date, the Soviets didn't make any expansion movements until the Second World War. In the Second World War, which started with the invasion of Poland by Germany in 1939, the Soviet Union also occupied eastern Poland. Thus, the Russians regained the western borderlands they lost in the First World War 25 years later. The Soviet Union, led by Stalin, declared war on Finland in December 1939, starting the Winter War. Then in the summer of 1940, the 3 previously independent Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were occupied by the Soviets. As peace ended when the German-led Axis forces crossed the Soviet border on June 22, 1941, Germany captured Ukraine and besieged Leningrad. Threatening to seize the capital Moscow, Germany suffered two major defeats in Stalingrad and Kursk, and the tide of the World War II turned in favor of the USSR. By the end of 1943, the Red Army had broken the German siege of Leningrad and recaptured most of Ukraine and Western Russia. The war ended successfully for the Soviet Union, as the Red Army entered eastern Germany, capturing Berlin in May 1945. While the issue of the future of the Eastern Europe was discussed at the Potsdam Conference held in 1945, there was a difference of opinion between Stalin and US President Harry Truman. As a result, the process called the Cold War began between the two sides. Western states led by the United States formed NATO, while a few states led by the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact. Although the two sides took a war position in various parts of the world from time to time, they never directly entered into a hot conflict. When the dates show 1991, as a result of the Soviet leader Gorbachev's policies to be discussed, 15 republics declared their independence, while the Union of Soviet Social Republics was officially dissolved. When the dates showed the year 2000, Russian leader Boris Yeltsin resigned and handed over the government to Vladimir Putin, a former KGB agent. The Russian army, which entered the rapid recovery period under the leadership of Putin, emerged victorious from the Second Chechen War, which started in 2000 and ended in 2009. When the dates show 2014, Putin took action for Crimea this time. The Crimean Peninsula, which was under the rule of Moscow during the period of Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union, was connected to Ukraine by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in 1954. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, it continued to exist as an autonomous body affiliated to Ukraine. However, Putin held a controversial referendum on the peninsula, arguing that Crimea is Russian territory. Upon the result of the referendum accepting the participation of Russia, it was connected to the sovereignty of Russia on March 18, 2014. Although this event was met with a reaction by the whole world, it will not be the last invasion of Ukrainian lands by Russia. Only 1 month after the annexation of Crimea, Russian separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk region declared their autonomy from Ukraine. With Russia's support for the separatist idea, the Ukrainian army began to clash with the separatists in the region. These conflicts, which continue until today, turned into the Ukraine-Russia war in February 2022. Although the Russian army, which crossed the Ukrainian border in February, penetrated close to Kiev, it had to retreat with the counterattack of the Ukrainian army. Despite all international opposition, Putin announced on September 30, 2022, that he had formally annexed the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. Thanks for watching. See you in the next